They laughed in her face. Right there on 126th Street, loud enough for the whole block to hear. And nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Not yet. Chapter 1. The laugh that landed wrong. Some sounds don't belong in certain places. A car backfiring on a quiet Sunday, glass breaking inside a church, and laughter, the wrong kind of laughter, echoing down a Harlem block where everybody knows everybody, and everybody's always watching. That was the sound that started this. It was a Tuesday morning. The kind Harlem does quietly. Stoops still damp from the night before. The fish market on the corner just opening its crates. Old men with newspapers folded under their arms. Not yet ready to sit, just standing. The way men stand when they want to see the day before the day sees them. The building on 126th was nothing remarkable from the outside. 4 stories. Brick face. A front door that stuck in the summer and swelled shut in the winter. But to the people on that block, it wasn't a building, it was an address. It was where Mrs. Caldwell had raised 3 children alone after her husband came back from Korea and never quite came all the way back. It was where her daughter learned to read by the window on the 2nd floor because the light hit it right in the afternoon. It was where her youngest son took his first steps on the 3rd floor hallway while the neighbors clapped. To outside eyes, it was square footage. To Harlem, it was a life. Now, the men arrived in 2 cars. Not the kind of cars that belonged on 126th, the kind that belonged parked outside Midtown offices. Clean, dark, and expensive in a way that wasn't accidental. 3 men in suits, one of them carrying a briefcase that he held, like it gave him authority just to touch it. They were investors. That was the word they used. Investors. As if the word alone was supposed to open doors and quiet rooms and make people feel grateful for being noticed. They had been circling Harlem for months. Not the Harlem that had history and weight and a heartbeat. The Harlem that existed on paper, on maps, on property reports, on city rezoning documents that got passed around in conference rooms where no one in them had ever once eaten at a counter on Lenox Avenue or bought a number from a man in a hat. They saw the building on 126th as an opportunity. Mrs. Caldwell saw it as her home. She had come outside that morning because she was told to. No, a letter had arrived. The kind of letter with clean letterhead and complicated language designed to make the reader feel small before they even reached the 2nd paragraph. She had asked her neighbor, old Mr. Pierre, to read it with her twice. Then she had written a time on a piece of paper and put on her good coat and come downstairs to meet these men, because that is what you do when you are a woman who was raised to hold your head up even when someone is trying to take something from you. She stood at the bottom of the steps. They barely looked up when they got out of the car. The one with the briefcase, the tallest one, the one who clearly considered himself the lead, glanced at her the way you glance at furniture you're already planning to replace. He started talking before he finished walking toward her. Numbers, projections, what the building could be, what it needed to be. He used the word potential 4 times in the first 2 minutes, and not once did he say her name. So even though it was written right there at the top of the letter he had sent her, she asked a question, a fair one. What would happen to the current tenants if the sale went through? And that's when it happened. The tall one looked at the man to his left. The man to his left looked at the third, and they laughed. Not quietly, not even trying to make it polite. A full, open, dismissive laugh. The kind that says, "You don't actually think your question matters, do you?" One of them said something under his breath. The words didn't carry far, but the tone did. The tone carried all the way down the block. Mrs. Caldwell did not cry. That matters. She stood very still. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her chin did not drop. But something moved behind her eyes. Not fear, not humiliation. Something older than both of those things. The look of a woman who has survived things that would have ended other people, and who in this moment was calculating exactly what kind of world she was standing in. The old men with their newspapers had gone still. The fish market had gone quiet. Even the street seemed to hold itself, because everyone on that block understood something that those 3 men in their clean dark cars did not. They understood that this particular block, on this particular morning, was not a place where you could laugh at a woman like Mrs. Caldwell without consequence. And not because of any law, not because of any formal authority, because of who else was always present, even when you couldn't see him yet. The tall one was still talking when the door to the building across the street opened. No hurry to it, no drama, just a door opening. The way a door opens when the person behind it has nowhere urgent to be, because the most important thing happening today is already right in front of them. Bumpy Johnson stepped out onto his stoop. Now, he had a coffee cup in his hand. He was dressed the way he always dressed, neat, considered, unhurried. He looked down the block. He saw Mrs. Caldwell. He saw the three men. He saw the briefcase. He read the entire scene the way a man reads a page he has read 100 times before, quickly, completely, and without surprise. He took one sip of his coffee. Then he set the cup down slowly on the railing beside him, and he began to walk. Not fast, not slow. So the way a man walks when he has already decided what happens next, and the only thing left is to let it unfold. The tall investor hadn't noticed him yet. He was still talking. He would stop talking soon. Chapter 2. What the block already knew. There are two kinds of power in this world. The kind that announces itself, that needs a title, a uniform, a room full of people watching to feel real. And the kind that doesn't need any of that. The kind that simply is, the way gravity simply is. Shaya, you don't see it, you don't hear it, but you feel it the moment you step outside the boundaries of what it allows. Harlem knew which kind Bumpy Johnson carried. It had known for a long time. To understand what happened on 126th Street that Tuesday morning, you have to understand something that no newspaper ever printed correctly, and no outsider ever fully grasped no matter how long they studied it from a distance. Bumpy Johnson was not feared in Harlem. He was respected in Harlem. And those two things are not the same, not even close. Fear makes people look away when you walk into a room. Respect makes them straighten up. Fear makes a neighborhood go quiet when your name is spoken. Respect makes it go still, the way it goes still before something important is said. Fear is a cold thing, transactional, temporary. The moment the feared man loses his teeth, the fear evaporates. It leaves nothing behind. Respect is structural. It holds weight. No, it doesn't evaporate when circumstances change. It gets passed down from mother to daughter, from old man to young man, from corner to corner, as a kind of unspoken civic memory. That was what Bumpy had built in Harlem. Not an empire of terror, an architecture of trust. He had come up in these streets the way most men of his generation came up, through difficulty that didn't ask permission before it arrived. He had seen poverty that was indifferent to character. He had seen good men broken by systems that were never designed to hold their weight. He had navigated the machinery of organized crime not because it was his dream, but because in the Harlem he grew up in, the machinery of legitimate power was a door with no handle on his side. And so he found another way in. But what separated Bumpy from the men who simply grabbed and consumed and moved on? What made him something different, something Harlem held on to, was that he never forgot where he came from. And he never pretended the people around him were scenery in his own story. He read, widely, seriously, with genuine hunger. James Baldwin, Langston Hughes, history, philosophy. He could sit across from a scholar and hold the conversation, or sit across from a man who couldn't read and hold that conversation too, with equal seriousness, equal presence. He understood that dignity is not a reward for education or money. It is a baseline. It belongs to everyone. That belief was not performative. It showed up in how he moved through the world. When a family on his block fell behind, and families fell behind constantly in Harlem because the margins were thin and the city was not generous, the help came quietly. No announcement. No debt attached to it in a way that diminished the person receiving it. Food appeared, rent got handled. A word was spoken in the right place that opened a door that had been closed. He did not do these things to be loved. He did them because they were right. But the neighborhood saw. The neighborhood always sees, even when it doesn't speak. And over years, those quiet acts accumulated into something you cannot manufacture, cannot buy, and cannot fake. They accumulated into the kind of standing that means when you walk down a block, people don't just see a man. They see everything that man has ever done for them, so layered beneath the present moment, like sediment beneath a river. That was what those three investors walked into on 126th Street. They had no idea it was there. The block had its own language. Not words exactly, more like signals. Small shifts in posture and atmosphere that people who grew up there read without thinking. When something was simply business, the block moved around it the way water moves around a stone. But when something was wrong, when something violated the unspoken contract of how people here were to be treated, the block responded. Not necessarily with noise, sometimes with the opposite of noise, a stillness that was louder than anything. The moment those men laughed at Mrs. Caldwell, the block shifted. The old men with their newspapers didn't put them down or step forward. They just stopped turning pages. The woman sweeping her front steps didn't stop sweeping. She just slowed. And the child sitting on the fire escape stairs above looked down at the men in the suits with an expression no child that age should have to wear. The expression of recognizing already that certain people do not see you, and understanding what that means. The block did not react loudly. It contracted. And in that contraction, in that collective drawing inward of breath, there was a message being sent upward, sideways, across the street, through walls, through windows, through the specific and ancient communication system of a community that has learned to protect itself through awareness. And Bumpy received it. He had been inside when it started. That mattered. He was not standing on his stoop looking for trouble. He was not positioned. He was simply a man in his home on a Tuesday morning, doing what a man does at that hour. Coffee, the paper, the quiet before the day made its demands. He was not the story yet. But then a sound reached him. And not the words, not the specific content of the exchange happening 40 feet away outside his window. Just the shape of it. The pitch and timbre of laughter that has no warmth in it. Laughter that is a weapon wearing a casual face. He had heard that sound before. He knew exactly what it meant. He set his newspaper down on the table, folded it the way he always folded it, deliberately, with patience, the way you finish one thing properly before beginning the next. He stood. Now he picked up his coffee cup. He moved to the window first, not the door, because a man who has survived as long as Bumpy Johnson survived does not walk into a scene he hasn't looked at first. He looked. He saw Mrs. Caldwell standing straight. He saw the three men. He saw the briefcase, the suits, the clean, dark cars that did not belong here. He saw the angle of her chin, held up, refusing to drop. And in that angle, he read everything. The dignity she was protecting at personal cost. On the faces of women all across Harlem. On the faces of women all across Harlem who were asked, daily, to absorb indignity and call it normal. He set the coffee cup down on the railing. He did not hurry. He did not reach for anything. He simply descended the steps and began to walk toward the situation with the calm, on total authority of a man who has already decided, not in anger, not in impulse, but in something far more permanent than either of those things, that what is happening over there is going to stop. The investors still didn't see him coming. They were laughing again about something else now, comfortable in their own frequency, unaware completely that the atmosphere around them had already changed. The block knew. Caldwell's eyes moved, just slightly, to a point past the shoulder of the tall man with the briefcase. And for the first time that morning, something softened in her face. Not relief exactly, recognition. Chapter 3. The Woman on the Steps. There are people in every neighborhood who are not famous, who will never have their names in a newspaper, never be the subject of a story, never be remembered by anyone outside of a 4-block radius. But within those 4 blocks, within that small, in specific geography of shared life, they are load-bearing. They are the people the community rests on without ever saying so out loud. Remove them, and something structural gives way. Something you can't immediately name, but immediately feel. Mrs. Caldwell was one of those people. Her first name was Gloria. Most people on the block didn't use it. She had been Mrs. Caldwell for so long, through marriage, through loss, through everything that came after, that the name had become something beyond a title. It was a designation, a category, the kind of name that means she is someone to be spoken to carefully and honestly, because she will know the difference. She had come to Harlem from Georgia in the late 40s, the way many came, on a Greyhound bus with a cardboard suitcase and an address written on the inside of her wrist in blue ink in case she lost the paper. She had been 19. She had been carrying the specific ambition of someone who grew up watching the world be small and decided early that the world was going to have to get bigger, or she was going to make it bigger herself. She found work. She found the building on 126th. She found eventually a husband, a quiet, steady man named Robert, who worked at the post office and brought home his full paycheck every Friday and never once made her feel that his contribution was larger than hers. They built something modest and solid, the kind of life that doesn't look like much from the outside, but is, from the inside, an act of sustained will. Then Robert came back from Korea, and the man who came back was not entirely the man who had left. He functioned. He continued. He went to work and came home and sat at the dinner table. But something behind his eyes had been rearranged in a way that neither of them ever found the words for. He lasted 7 more years, good years. So, in the way years can be good, even when something is missing from them. And then one winter morning, he simply did not wake up, and Mrs. Caldwell was 41 years old with 3 children, and a building that would now require her, alone, to hold everything together. She held everything together. The block understood her history the way a block understands its own history, not through documents or formal telling, but through proximity and time, and the accumulated observation of people who live close enough to each other to know what is never said. They knew which window she sat by when she couldn't sleep. They knew the sound of her moving through the hallways in the early morning, quiet and purposeful. The way someone moves when they have learned not to disturb others, even in their own exhaustion. They knew how she spoke to her children, directly, without softening what was hard, but never without love underneath the directness. They knew which families on the block she had helped when the help was needed, and how she had offered it without the performance of generosity that diminishes the person receiving it. She had, over the years, become something the block did not have a formal word for, something between a grandmother and a standard, a living proof that dignity was possible here, that a life built on limited resources and unlimited difficulty could still contain beauty and agency and self-possession, that Harlem, for all the ways the outside world tried to reduce it, produced people of extraordinary interior architecture. She was one of them, and those 3 men had laughed in her face. The letter had arrived 11 days earlier. She had read it twice at her kitchen table, once quickly and once slowly, the way you read something when you want to make sure your first reading didn't misunderstand the second paragraph. It did not misunderstand it. The language was legal and distant and deliberately complex, but the meaning was simple enough once you stripped away the paper it was dressed in. They wanted the building, and they had identified it as part of a larger acquisition, several properties on the block, quietly purchased over the previous 18 months from landlords who didn't live in them, and therefore felt no particular grief in selling. The building on 126th was one of the last pieces. Mrs. Caldwell was a tenant with a long lease and certain protections, but the letter made clear between its careful lines that protections had limits, and that what was being offered was a sum of money in exchange for her cooperation, and that her cooperation would make things considerably simpler for everyone involved. For everyone involved, as if she and the investors were involved in the same thing, as if her home and their portfolio were equivalent weights on the same scale. She had put the letter down and looked out her window at the block below, at the children on the sidewalk, at the fish market, at the old men with their papers, and at the life that existed in that small geography of shared survival. And she had made a decision that was never really a decision because it was never actually a question. She was not leaving. She had told no one about the letter, not because she was ashamed or afraid, but because Mrs. Caldwell did not believe in carrying problems to people before she had first tried to carry them herself. It was part of her architecture, this refusal to become a burden before becoming a fighter. She would meet these men. She would hear what they had to say. She would stand in her good coat at the bottom of her steps, and she would ask her questions clearly, and she would see what kind of men they actually were. She found out quickly. The tall one, the one who held his briefcase like a credential, had not looked at her when he spoke. He had looked at the building. And he spoke about square footage and structural assessments and projected returns the way you speak about an object, the way you speak about something that has no interior life, no history, no claim on the future beyond what you intend to assign it. She asked her question. What happens to the people living here? Simple. Direct. The only question that actually mattered. And the laughter came. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In this context, it was enough. Because in those 4 seconds, something was communicated that no contract language and no formal letter had managed to say as clearly. It was communicated in the way these things are always most clearly communicated. Not through words, which can be managed and shaped and softened, but through the unguarded reflex of a man who believes he is among people who share his assumptions. You don't matter. Your question doesn't matter. This block doesn't matter. You are an obstacle, dressed nicely, asking us to pretend otherwise. That was what the laugh said. Mrs. Caldwell heard all of it. She did not move, did not waver. Her chin stayed exactly where it was, but her eyes, and this was the thing that the tall man would not have noticed because he was not looking at her eyes. Her eyes moved just once to a point over his left shoulder. She had seen Bumpy step off the curb. She had seen him begin to walk. And something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the particular expression of a woman who has been standing alone in a difficult place and has just felt the ground beneath her become, without announcement, considerably more solid. She returned her eyes to the tall man. She let him finish talking. She waited. Because she knew, the way the block knew, the way every person within eye line of that sidewalk knew, that the scene had already changed. The investors just didn't know it yet. They were still inside their own version of the morning, still operating on their original assumptions, still believing that this was a transaction between people who held power and a woman who did not. They had not yet understood where they were standing. They had not yet understood whose block this was. They would. In a few more steps, they would. Chapter 4. The Locked Entrance. There is a particular moment in any confrontation, before the words, before the positioning, before anything that can be formally described as an event, where the atmosphere changes. Not gradually, all at once. Like a barometric shift before a storm. The air doesn't look different. The street doesn't look different. But something in the body registers it before the mind catches up. Something ancient and animal that exists beneath language, beneath reason, beneath all the careful architecture of civilized behavior. Every person on that block felt it the moment Bumpy stepped off the curb. The investors felt it too. They just didn't know what it was yet. He crossed the street without urgency. That was the first thing you noticed. In a moment that every instinct in the surrounding environment was reading as charged, as loaded, as the kind of moment that could tip in any direction. Bumpy Johnson walked as if he were simply moving from one room to another. Unhurried, deliberate. His hands were visible and still. His face carried no performance of anger, no theatrical hardness, none of the signals that men use when they want to announce themselves as dangerous before they arrive. He did not need to announce anything. He simply arrived. The tall investor, the one with the briefcase, the one who had laughed first and loudest, noticed him when Bumpy was about 12 feet away. He registered the approach the way men register approaches when they are not accustomed to being approached. With a flicker of mild irritation, the expression of someone whose private conversation has been interrupted by someone who probably wants something. He turned slightly. He started to say something, the beginning of a sentence. "Can I help?" And then he stopped. Not because of anything Bumpy said. Bumpy had not said anything yet. He stopped because of what he saw in Bumpy's face, or more precisely, what he did not see. There was no aggression there, no heat, no performance, just a quality of absolute stillness that is, in its own way, more unsettling than any of those things. The stillness of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply executing it. The stillness of complete certainty. The investor's sentence did not finish itself, it just stopped. Bumpy looked at him for one long moment. Then he looked at Mrs. Caldwell, and not with apology in his eyes, not with the theatrical chivalry of a man performing rescue, just with acknowledgement. A look that said, I see you. I see what happened here. I see that you have been standing straight through something you should not have had to stand through alone. Mrs. Caldwell gave the smallest nod. Then Bumpy looked back at the tall investor. He said two words. Come inside. Not a question. Not an invitation in any conventional sense of the word. The tone was level, and almost quiet, the kind of voice you use when you are saying something you will not repeat. The kind of voice that understands silence as punctuation. The tall investor opened his mouth. Bumpy had already turned toward the building entrance. What happened next was the thing people on the block would talk about for years afterward, not loudly. Not as a dramatic story to be performed at tables, but quietly. The way you talk about something that clarified something for you. Without raising his voice, without raising his voice, without turning around, without any gesture toward the men still standing on the sidewalk. He said a single word to the man positioned just inside the doorway, a man who had appeared there with the same quiet inevitability that Bumpy himself had appeared. The way certain people materialize in the right place at the right time when the situation requires it, which is to say, not by accident. He said, door, and the door closed. Not slammed, not thrown, not closed with any of the theatrical violence that the moment might have seemed to invite. It was closed the way you close a door at the end of a day, firmly, completely, with the calm finality of something that is simply done now. The lock turned. The sound it made was small. On a busy street with traffic and voices and the ambient noise of a Harlem morning, it should have been inaudible. But in that particular configuration of stillness, with the block holding its breath and the fish market quiet and the old men's newspapers forgotten in their hands, that small mechanical sound of a lock sliding into place was somehow the loudest thing anyone had heard all morning. The three investors stood on the sidewalk. For a moment, none of them moved. No, the tall one looked at the door, then at his colleagues, then back at the door. There was a sequence of expressions moving across his face. Confusion first, then something approaching indignation, then something else, something less certain, something that was beginning to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that the rules of the game had just changed, and he had not been consulted about the change. He stepped toward the door. He tried the handle. It did not move. He tried it again, with slightly more pressure. The way you try a handle a second time, even when you know the result will be the same, because the body needs confirmation of what the mind has already accepted. It did not move. He turned to his colleagues. One of them said something in a low voice. The tone of it was uncertain. The voice of a man recalibrating, trying to locate himself within a situation that no longer matched the map he had brought with him. The third investor said nothing at all. He was looking at the building, at the windows, at the block around them, and in his silence was the beginning of a comprehension that the others were still resisting. He was starting to understand, with the specific clarity that comes when a man removes his assumptions and simply looks at where he actually is, that he and his colleagues were not, in fact, the most powerful people on this block. They had not been for a single moment since they arrived. They had simply not known it. Inside, the building had its own kind of quiet. Not the tense quiet of a standoff, the settled quiet of a place that knows what it is and does not feel the need to explain itself. The hallway smelled of cooking and old wood, and the specific domestic accumulation of years of ordinary life lived with intention. The kind of smell that is, itself, an argument against every projection and assessment and portfolio strategy that had brought those men here today. Bumpy stood in the hallway. He was in no hurry. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the staircase. He looked at the door at the end of the hall. He gave no indication of what came next, which was, in its own way, more destabilizing to the men outside than anything he could have said or done. because the men outside were used to controlling sequence. They were used to being the ones who determined what happened next, who set the agenda, who moved the meeting forward, who decided when things were over. And that control was the foundation of everything they believed about themselves and their position in any room. And now, they were not in the room. They were outside, with a locked door between them, and the only man who could decide when any of this continued. On the sidewalk, the tall investor knocked. Twice. Politely at first. Then with slightly less polish. No answer came. The block watched. Not obviously, not the way a crowd watches a spectacle. The way a neighborhood watches something it has been waiting, without naming it, to see. Small glances over shoulders, eyes that didn't quite leave the scene even as bodies pretended to be occupied with other things. Mrs. Caldwell had moved to the side of the steps. She stood with her hands folded in front of her. She was not smiling, but she was not afraid anymore either. And that specific absence of fear in the face of a woman who had been standing alone in a difficult place all morning, was its own kind of statement, its own kind of answer to the question those men had asked with their laughter. Who matters here? The door had answered it, the lock had answered it, and now the waiting answered it. Because Bumpy Johnson was inside, and the door would open when Bumpy decided it opened. Not before. Not on anyone else's schedule. Not because anyone knocked harder or with more authority or with the full weight of their briefcase and their portfolio and their clean dark cars parked at the curb. It would open when he was ready, and he was, very clearly, very deliberately, not yet ready. Chapter 5. The Conversation in the Quiet Room. There is a difference between silence used as absence and silence used as presence. Most people use silence because they have nothing to say, or because they are afraid of what saying something might cost them. That kind of silence is passive. It takes up no space. It asks nothing of the people around it. Then, there is the other kind. The kind that is fully inhabited. The kind that a man places in a room the way you place a piece of furniture, deliberately, with knowledge of exactly what it does to the dimensions of the space. The kind of silence that makes other people feel the need to fill it, and in filling it, reveal far more than they intended. That was the silence Bumpy Johnson brought into the room when the investors finally came inside. It had taken 11 minutes. That was how long they stood on the sidewalk before the door opened again. Not because Bumpy had forgotten them. Not because anything required exactly 11 minutes, but because 11 minutes was the right amount of time, long enough to remove all residual confidence from men who had arrived with too much of it, short enough that the lesson remained crisp. A man who has been waiting outside his own meeting for 11 minutes is not the same man who stepped out of a clean, dark car with a briefcase under his arm. Something has shifted in him, something that lived in his posture, and his assumption and the angle of his chin has been quietly, irrevocably adjusted. The door opened without announcement. The man who had closed it simply stepped aside, and the three investors entered, single file, without the wide-shouldered ease with which they had arrived, into the hallway of a building they had come here to acquire. Bumpy was already seated when they entered the room. That mattered. In any negotiation, in any confrontation, in any human exchange where power is being established or contested, the person already seated when others enter holds a specific and significant advantage. It communicates unhurried authority. It says, without saying, I was here before you, I will be here after you, and this room is already mine regardless of what either of us says next. He sat in a chair that was not remarkable, wooden, straight-backed, near the window that looked out onto the block below. He had, at some point in the 11 minutes, acquired a fresh cup of coffee, which was either a coincidence or a deliberate gesture so precise in its effect that it functioned as a kind of art. A man with a fresh cup of coffee is a man who is comfortable. A man who is comfortable is a man who is not worried about you. And a man who is not worried about you has already won whatever this is. He looked at the three investors as they arranged themselves in the room. He did not gesture toward chairs. He did not offer them anything. He did not smooth the entry with the social lubricants that men use to make difficult encounters feel temporarily normal. He simply looked at them and waited. The tall investor spoke first. Of course he did. And he was a man accustomed to controlling rooms with language, and the silence was costing him more than it was costing anyone else. Every second of it was a second in which his prepared script, the projections, the numbers, the careful framing of the acquisition as mutual benefit, was becoming less useful, less relevant. He could feel it losing its power the longer the silence held, the way a weapon loses its power once the other side has demonstrated that it doesn't frighten them. He said he wasn't sure what this was about. He said it with measured professionalism, controlled, trying to reclaim the register of the boardroom, the conference room, the world where he knew the rules and the rules favored him. Bumpy let the sentence finish. He took a sip of his coffee. He set the cup down. Then he spoke. He did not speak loudly. And that was the first thing the investors would have noticed, the thing that would have recalibrated their nervous systems in ways they couldn't entirely account for. They had prepared on some level for aggression, for the kind of confrontation that loud men conduct, the raised voice, the territorial display, the performance of threat that, paradoxically, always contains within it the seed of negotiation. Loud men can be reasoned with. Loud men are afraid of something. Shows and fear can be worked with. Bumpy's voice was quiet. Not soft. There is a distinction. Soft suggests uncertainty, suggests that the speaker is asking to be heard. Quiet suggests that the speaker has never once doubted he would be heard, and therefore sees no reason to perform the asking. He said, "You laughed at a woman on her own steps." Not a question, not an accusation that invited defense. A statement of fact, placed in the center of the room the way you place something heavy on a table. Not to be examined, but to be acknowledged. The tall investor began to respond. Something about a misunderstanding. Something about the context. Something about how things sometimes come across differently than intended. Bumpy did not interrupt him. He waited for the sentence to end. Then he said, "I know what you intended." 4 words, and the room changed again. Because in those 4 words was something more unsettling than anger, more destabilizing than threat. In those 4 words was the absolute removal of the investor's ability to reframe the situation, to manage it, to use the tools he had spent his entire professional life sharpening. "I know what you intended. Not I think. Not it seemed like. Not any of the hedged, softened language that leaves room for the other party to maneuver. I know." Which meant that the explanation, the context, the misunderstanding, the careful reconstruction of the moment as something other than what it was not going to work here. The man sitting across from them had already seen through to the intention, had already named it to himself, and was not, under any circumstances, going to pretend otherwise as a courtesy. The tall investor closed his mouth. Bumpy looked at each of them in turn. Not with hatred. That was the thing that was hardest to process. The thing that the investors would find most difficult to explain afterward to themselves or anyone else. There was no hatred in his face, no desire to punish, no satisfaction in their discomfort, none of the vindictive pleasure that would have made the moment easier to categorize. What was there instead was something rarer and, in its own way, more severe. Disappointment. The specific, I-measured disappointment of a man who expected very little and found that even that small expectation had not been met. The disappointment of someone who has seen the worst that people are capable of so many times that he has stopped being surprised by it, but who refuses, on principle, to stop being troubled by it. He said, "This block has people on it, not square footage. People." He paused. "Mrs. Caldwell has been on these steps longer than your company has existed." Another pause. You one question, you laughed at you one question. No, one. You laughed at her." He looked at the tall investor specifically now. In front of her neighbors, in front of her block, in front of people who have watched her hold this building together for 20 years. He picked up his coffee cup. He did not drink from it yet. He just held it. That's not a misunderstanding. The second investor, the one who had gone quiet on the sidewalk, the one who had started to understand before the others, had his eyes on the floor. Not in shame exactly, in the specific private reckoning of a man who knows he participated in something and is deciding, in real time, what to do with that knowledge. The third investor was very still, and the tall one was looking at Bumpy with the expression of a man who has just realized that the map he brought does not match the territory he is standing in, and that there is no version of this conversation that ends with him winning something. Bumpy let the silence hold for another moment. Then he said, "Now." Just that. Now. And something in the room reorganized itself around that single word. Something that had been suspended. The question of what all of this was building toward. Now, he told them what was going to happen. Not into threat, not into ultimatum, into clarity. He told them what was going to happen. Not what he wanted to happen. Not what he was proposing or requesting or suggesting. What was going to happen? Mrs. Caldwell's lease would be renewed, extended with terms in writing that were clear enough that no future letter could obscure their meaning. The tenants in the building would receive the same. If the investors wished to continue their activity in this part of Harlem, they would do it with the understanding that certain properties were not available to them, not because of any legal barrier, because of a decision that had been made in this room today. He was not asking. He was describing the future. There was no threat attached to this description, no implication of what would happen if the description was not honored. The absence of that implication was itself the most powerful element of everything he had said, because it communicated something that explicit threats cannot communicate. I don't need to tell you what happens if you don't. You already know, and we both know you know. So, let's not perform the rest of it. The tall investor looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving behind his eyes, a series of calculations, an internal audit of leverage and exposure and risk, a man running through every option he had come into this room with and finding, one by one, that none of them were available to him in the way he had assumed. He nodded. Once. Slowly. Not with grace. Not with the warmth of a man who has been convinced. With the particular private surrender of someone who has understood that the conversation is over and that his participation in what comes next is compliance, not agreement. Bumpy looked at him. He nodded back. Then he stood. He walked to the door. He opened it himself, the same door that had been locked for 11 minutes, the door that had done more work this morning than any word spoken on either side. And he held it without ceremony, without triumph, without any of the theatrical weight that the moment might have invited. The investors filed out, the tall one last. At the threshold he paused, just for a fraction of a second, and looked back at Bumpy. Bumpy looked at him with perfect patience. Bumpy looked at him with perfect patience and waited for him to leave. He left. The door closed again, this time gently. The lock did not turn. It didn't need to. Chapter 6. What Harlem Remembered. The cars left the block the same way they had arrived. Dark, clean, shine. Different in the way that all shine. Different in the way that all things are different once something has happened inside them. Once the people riding in them have been fundamentally, quietly, permanently recalibrated by an experience they did not anticipate and cannot fully explain. The block watched them go, not with celebration, not with the released tension of people who have witnessed a victory and want to mark it, with something quieter than that, something more considered, the way people watch something leave that should not have come in the first place. Bumpy did not watch them go. He was already back inside. He had returned to his chair, the same wooden chair by the window, and retrieved his newspaper, which had been folded and waiting on the table beside him with the patience of an object that understood it would be returned to eventually. He opened it to where he had left off. He picked up his coffee, which was no longer hot, but which he drank anyway, without complaint. The way a man drinks coffee that has gone cold when the morning has asked more of him than coffee temperature. He read. Outside, the block slowly resumed itself. The old men unfolded their newspapers. The woman who had been sweeping her steps finished sweeping them. The child on the fire escape stairs went back to whatever children go back to when the adult world has briefly made itself visible. and then withdrawn again behind its usual surfaces. The fish market resumed its noise. A dog that had been sitting very still at the base of a stoop stood up, stretched, and moved on. And Mrs. Caldwell, sat down on her steps for the first time all morning. Not collapsing. Not the sitting of exhaustion or relief. The sitting of a woman who has been standing for a very long time and has decided now that she has earned the right to be still. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face toward the street, and she let the morning come to her instead of going to meet it. She did not look across at Bumpy's window. She didn't need to. Within 2 days, the paperwork was handled. Not through lawyers, not through any formal channel that left a visible trail in any official record. Through the older, more reliable infrastructure of a community that has learned to protect itself through relationships rather than institutions. A conversation here, a phone call there. The right words delivered to the right people in the particular register that makes clear this is not a request, but a conclusion. Mrs. Caldwell's lease was renewed, extended, now with terms written in language so plain and so direct that no future letter with clean letterhead and complicated sentences could find a gap in it wide enough to slide through. The other tenants in the building received the same. The investors did not return to 126th Street. They did not return to that part of Harlem at all. Not that season, not the following one, not in any subsequent year that anyone on the block could account for. Whether this was because of fear, because of the specific and private recalibration that had occurred in that quiet room, or because the simple arithmetic of their operation had changed once certain properties were no longer available to them. None of that was ever formally established. It did not need to be formally established. The block understood cause and effect. The story spread the way true stories spread in a neighborhood, not through announcements, not through any single telling, but through the organic accumulation of individual accounts, each one slightly different in its details and identical in its essential truth. The woman at the fish market told it one way. The old man with the newspaper told it another. The child who had been watching from the fire escape told it to other children in a version that was perhaps slightly more dramatic in its specifics and entirely accurate in its meaning. What survived across all the versions, what remained constant through every retelling, was not the locked door, though the locked door became, over time, the image around which the story crystallized, the detail that gave it its shape. What survived was the quality of how it had been done, the absence of raised voices, the absence of weapons, the absence, even, of any explicit threat. Just a man who walked across a street and made a decision and executed it with the calm, a total authority of someone who understood, not as philosophy but as lived practice, that real power does not need to announce itself. That was the part people kept returning to. That was the part that meant something, because Harlem had seen plenty of force. Force was not new here. Force was not impressive here. Force was what happened when someone wanted something and had the physical or institutional means to take it. Much in Harlem's experience, force came from many directions and wore many faces. Sometimes a badge, sometimes a gun, sometimes a pen signing a document in a midtown office. And its application was rarely followed by anything resembling justice. What Harlem had seen less of was this: restraint that cost something. Restraint chosen not because the alternative was unavailable, but because the man choosing had a longer view than the immediate moment. Because he understood that the way you win a moment matters as much as whether you win it. That a community watching how its conflicts are resolved is learning constantly what it is allowed to expect from the people it trusts. Bumpy had taught the block something that morning, not about what he was capable of, about what he chose, and the choosing, that deliberate, principled, costly choosing, was the thing that deepened the trust in a way that no demonstration of force ever could have. The violence creates compliance. Restraint creates loyalty. And loyalty in a community is the only currency that actually compounds over time. Mrs. Caldwell lived in that building for another 19 years. She watched her children become adults. She watched her grandchildren learn to walk in the same third-floor hallway where her youngest son had taken his first steps. She watched the block change around her. Some changes good, some not, with the specific. And the steady resilience of a woman who has decided that the world is going to have to work considerably harder than it has managed so far to move her. She and Bumpy never spoke at length about what happened that morning. They didn't need to. There exists, between certain people in a community, an understanding that operates beneath language, a mutual recognition that requires no formal acknowledgement because it already lives in every interaction, in the nod across the street, even the way one person's presence adjusts the atmosphere around another's, in the simple fact of two people continuing to share a block and a life and a set of unspoken obligations to each other and to the place they both call home. That was what they had, what the morning had made official. Bumpy Johnson died on a July afternoon in 1968. He was in his favorite restaurant at his usual table, in the middle of a conversation about, depending on who tells the story, chess or politics, or the future of Harlem, which in his mind were never entirely separate subjects. He died the way certain men die, who have lived at the necessary edge of things, without warning, without resolution, leaving sentences unfinished and questions open, and a silence in the people around him that was specific to him and could not be filled by anything else. Harlem grieved him the way it grieves its own. Not with the formal ceremony of public figures, though, that came too. With the particular, private grief of a community that has lost someone who was woven into its fabric in ways that are not visible until the thread is gone. The small griefs, the daily ones. The moment you turn to say something to someone who is no longer there. The instinct, reaching for a presence that has become absence, that takes years to fully retrain itself. But what he left behind was not absence, not entirely. He left behind a woman who kept her building, and a block that had watched something and remembered it. A standard, unwritten, unofficial, carried entirely in the collective memory of people who had been present or had heard it told by those who were. For what it looks like when a person of principle encounters a moment of injustice and responds not with heat, but with architecture, with calm, with restraint, with the long, patient, structural understanding that how you handle a moment is the message you send to everyone watching about what is possible, about what they are allowed to expect, about what kind of world this particular block, this particular community, this particular inheritance of survival and dignity and self-possession is committed to being. That was the legacy, not the locked door, though the locked door was the symbol. The legacy was the choice behind it, the decision made by a man on a Tuesday morning with a coffee cup in his hand that a woman standing alone in a difficult place on her own steps deserved to not be alone in it, that someone would cross the street, that the door would close, that the room would be quiet, and that when the door opened again, things would be different. Not because of fear, because of Bumpy Johnson, because of who he chose to be, because of what Harlem, watching, learned was possible. Some men leave records, and some men leave buildings. Bumpy Johnson left something harder to measure and longer to last. He left the memory in the people who saw it of what it looks like when power serves something larger than itself. And in Harlem, that memory never fully went away.